Let's talk about jobs in prison because I had a lot of different jobs over the 19 years that I was locked up, including the last job, which included cleaning up human waste because I was a medical worker. And this was actually a highly desired job because I was at a prison that had dormitories. You just got 82 people sleeping in an open bay, open showers, open toilets, no privacy. So going over to work, getting away from the building and going to work around a bunch of nurses all day was not the worst thing. One of the qualifications or one of the requirements of the job was that I be on call to clean up human waste. So if there was an old man in one of the buildings who had an accident in the shower, if somebody got stabbed, if somebody got really sick and threw up, if somebody, wet their ped, whatever, my job was to come in and clean up that waste. And the crazy thing is, I didn't mind it because compared to being locked in that dorm all day with other people, I was like, yeah, that'll work. When I think about the jobs, and I had, again, a lot of different jobs. I worked in a wood shop. I was a tutor. I was a mentor. I worked on maintenance. That's how I ended up becoming a journeyman electrician. I had a lot of different jobs and had a lot of different experience and learned a lot of different things. Now, the process for getting a job in prison was kind of how I imagine it is at a corrupt corporation or in a corrupt city. It's really about who you know or what you know or how you can kind of work into the system. Now, some of the lower level jobs like the kitchen or the houseman. So housemen are people assigned to clean the pod, to clean the floor, clean the shower, clean the microwave, wipe the rails. And even among those, like the floor man makes more money. So the microwave guy might make 27 cents an hour for 15 hours a week, whereas the floor man might make 45 cents an hour for 30 hours a week. So he's making twice as much money, more than twice as much money. So it's worth it. It means a big difference. Those jobs, the base level jobs, the entry level jobs like that in the kitchen that nobody really wanted or nobody really fought over, those were fairly standard. You would go, you would get on a list, and as soon as your name came up, it would happen because they were transitory. There weren't a lot of guys who stayed there for a long period of time. So you would go, you would clean the microwave for a while. You might try to work your way up to a floor man. You might try to work your way up to wherever else. Same with the kitchen. Like I never worked in the kitchen because it was miserable. I mean, in those buildings alone, it might be 100, 110 degrees in the summer. There was no air conditioning. There was no good airflow. So then going into the kitchen where you also have ovens and pots boiling and things cooking, it was just horrendous. You'd see guys coming out of the kitchen, coming off work, and their whites, the things they wore in the kitchen, were just soaked. Like they had jumped in a pool of water and then walked back. And that's how they were serving food. And that's how they were cooking food. It was just inhumane. Now, the one advantage of the kitchen that a lot of guys liked, you might still make that same 27 or 35 or 45 cents an hour, but you could work overtime. And this was not overtime on the street where you get time and a half or you get extra benefits. It just meant you could work more hours. So some guys who really did their bid based on working and just staying busy would be in the kitchen. They might be there 80 or 100 hours a week. You might get 350 hours in a month because to them, that was being out of the dorm or being out of the pod. That was moving around. That was doing something. And I get it. I got bored too. Wasn't what I went for, but again, I understood. Any job above that, or even a good job in the kitchen, or a floorman job in the pod, or any of the kind of more desired jobs that paid better, was often about who you know, who you were willing to pay, or who you were willing to tell on. Because to get those jobs, guys were willing to fight over it. So say I come to a compound and I know the guy who happens to work for the unit manager, or I know the guy who happens to work for one of the maintenance supervisors. And I say, hey, I need a job. Well, the first job that comes up, he might put me first in line. Doesn't matter if 100 people apply. I remember when I was working maintenance supervisor would bring in all the applications that people had filled out. We would look at them, we'd be like, yeah, give those 2 interviews. He would ask us because he knew we would have a better idea of who we were dealing with and who their character was, or what their character was. Now, that's a catch-22, because on the one hand, yes, we could say, hey, that guy's going to steal from you, that guy's not going to work, that guy's a piece of whatever. On the other hand, it meant we could pick our friends or pick our buddies. And it really depended on who that was and whether it was fair. And for the most part, we always try to say, hey, if somebody's qualified, we want to give them a chance. Yes, we would rather have our guys on the crew, but at the same time, does that really matter that much? And a lot of the jobs that I got through that method. That's why I got my maintenance job. I was working in the law library, which was a good job. It had good pay, but there was no educational opportunity. There was no growth opportunity. Working on maintenance, I could get my on-the-job hours. I could take my apprenticeship and I could become a journeyman electrician. Working in the law library, I could continue to get an education. I could continue to help people, continue to clerk, but it wasn't the same thing because there was no certification that I could get. There was no further training. There was basically nothing else I could do from where I was. So I wanted to get that. So a bunch of my buddies were on the crew and they said, yo, just apply for the job. We got you. Didn't make me pay. Didn't make me do anything. They called me in for the interview. The boss was really hard on me. And he said he was hard on me because he wanted to make sure that I was actually smart. And I was all the things they said I was. Once he saw I was smart, I was capable, he's like, yeah, you got the job. You're good. I didn't get the paperwork for a few weeks, but he told me then that I had the job so I could tell my boss at the law library that I was leaving. She could find a replacement. Some of the other jobs, like the first maintenance type job I got was on the paint crew. To get the job on the paint crew, I had to pay somebody because the workers were running around. They were like, hey, we're taking applications. Who wants to go? And so one guy was like, yo, I got you. I'll put your application at the top. Just give me a pack of cigarettes. This is back when cigarettes were $5 or $6 a box. I can't remember. But anyway, so it was like $5 or $6 a pack of cigarettes. So given that, I got the job, which is cool. Some people would pay like boxes of cigarettes, like $20, $30, $40, $50, depending on what the situation was. So it was worth it to me because I got a job that paid me $54 a month and it cost me $6 or $5. And again, a lot of times that was the situation. You're sitting in there, you don't have a lot. There aren't a lot of jobs open. Like at one point we had a warden come in and he basically took half the jobs away. So now you have jobs for less than half the population. So people who don't have money coming in from the street are fighting because that's how they buy their coffee or their deodorant or their toothpaste or whatever basic things they need those jobs. So all of a sudden guys started selling them for more or selling them in special arrangements. And finally kind of the old heads or the gang guys or the neighborhood guys came in and were like, yo, y'all got to stop. You can't keep basically profiting off the poor, which is the problem with the prison system in general. It profits off the poor. That was when it kind of calmed down. But for a while, people were charging like multiple boxes of cigarettes for a job that would pay $54 a month. So you're paying more than $54. You're paying more than a month's wage to get a job. But again, if you didn't have anything else, it seemed like a good investment. Once you got those jobs or once somebody connected you with a job, yeah, it was about what you could do, what you'd learn. And my goal was always to learn everything I could and to have as many options as possible because I didn't know what my life would look like getting out of prison. I didn't know if I'd work a blue collar job or a white collar job or I'd work for myself. I had no idea. So I got as much experience in variety as possible. I worked in the factory, in the wood shop. So I worked the router, I worked a couple different machines. I did some custom building to test out new designs because we built furniture for all the state agencies. So the state schools, the state offices, the legislature, everybody, we would build their furniture. So somebody might have an idea in the office of, hey, I want to try to do this. Let's do a prototype. And then my job was to build the prototype, to figure out how to do it, figure out how to make a jig that would make that same piece over and over again. We would then assemble it, we would test it, we would see if anybody was interested. But it was really cool because I got to do different stuff every day. Because working on the edge bander or working in rough wood where I'm just like planing boards all day, that got really old. But when I got to do something new, that was still entertaining. Learned about electrical, I learned about electronics, I became a journeyman electrician, I was a tutor, I was a mentor, I worked in the law library. I basically tried to do a little bit of everything because I wanted to be able to go into a job, whatever that job was or whatever that career field was, and say, hey, this is my experience or this is my relevant experience or this is my relative expertise or knowledge because I wanted to have that background. Because again, I didn't know what the world was going to look like, so I wanted to have options. There's another thing that people talk a lot about work in prison, and often they call it negative. Or people say, oh, well, you should have to work, the old videos of breaking up rocks. Like you should have to break up rocks or you should have to carry stuff on your back or you should have to work in the fields. And if you ever see something horrible, look in Louisiana or Texas and see a range of black and brown people working while a white guy on a horse with a rifle is telling them to pick more cotton or pick more vegetables. It's pretty horrifying. But that's the reality because at the antebellum South, in the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War, they were looking for a replacement for the workforce. They said, we don't have people willing to work for wages. We need to figure out how to do this. They went from working with enslaved people to working with incarcerated people. And if you look at Jim Crow laws and a lot of things that came into place, they were just for that reason. And unfortunately, in some states, that is still the case. And in a lot of those states, people don't get paid. You don't get paid at all. In Virginia, like I said, I made 27 or 35 or 45 cents an hour, 15 or 30, or every now and then even 40 hours a week. And it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of pay the bills or get the commissary that I needed or get the basics, get the toothpaste and deodorant. In a lot of those states, you just work and you don't have a choice. And I get that people think people in prison deserve to be punished. The problem is if you're punishing people in inhumane conditions and allowing them to get the basic things, you're not really instilling the value of work. You're not teaching people, hey, work and like your life will be better. You'll have better things. You're teaching people that work is a punishment and a thing to be avoided at all costs. And when people are getting out, you don't want them to think that work is a punishment and a thing to be avoided at all costs. There are also people kind of on the other side who say nobody in prison should have to work. This is slave labor. This is forced. And I don't actually agree with that. I think that work is one of those things that can be incredibly beneficial. It just depends on the type of work. Ideally, we would not be defined or our personal identity wouldn't be around the work we do. Unfortunately, in our society, that is often the case. People won't say, hey, I'm Joe and I really like magic cards. They say, hey, I'm Joe, I'm a banker, or I'm a roofer, or I'm a whatever. But we are also a society that has a huge stigma and a huge prejudice against people with criminal records. We call them criminals, we call them convicts, we call them worthless, we call them hopeless. We tell them to stay away from us. The problem is people internalize that. The same way as if you tell somebody they're a success their whole life, well, they might internalize the idea that they're a success. If you tell someone they're a failure or they're hopeless or they're a criminal, they might internalize that. And work in prison was one of those opportunities for people to see their power and see their agency and see the capacity they had to do good and to build things where previously they had destroyed things. And that was true for me. I also think about like the firefighters out in California because you have about 100,000 incarcerated people in prison in California who are active firefighters. And when you think about that, I almost wore the shirt because I have one that says it. You could call them a convict, or you could call them a first responder. You could call them a criminal, or you could call them a firefighter. You could call them, illegal, or you could call them a hero. It really just depends on that label. And I do think that giving people the opportunity to work and build a new identity and find something meaningful to do and some meaningful way to see themselves is incredibly beneficial for them and their world and the world after they're released. The problem is, it depends what that work is. Now, when I was working maintenance and I was learning to do new things and learning to work on electrical and learning to work on cameras and learning to work on security systems, which is wild that I was working on security systems in prison, but I was learning new things. I was being pushed in a positive direction. So there was something beneficial that came out of that, including a journeyman electrical license, to where I knew I could get a job when I got out. If my job had been in the fields picking fruit and vegetables all day while somebody on a horseback threatened me and called me racial slurs or put me down or called me a criminal or a convict, well, yeah, that's not going to build me up. That's not going to add any value in my life. So it's really about, are we willing to employ people in ways that give them a new sense of identity, that teach them skills, and that teach them a way to look at themselves that may be different? I think it's very possible. I think it's very important. And I think work actually plays a very important part of the process of rehabilitation, because all of us, at least everybody that I know, works to some capacity. We work a job, or we run a business, or we work with a nonprofit, or we work on grants, or whatever the case is, we do something for work. And having that identity, and again, believing that work is something positive and it gets us to a better place, rather than that work is something terrible, it's a punishment and should be avoided. Because again, how do you expect somebody who believes that work is a punishment and should be avoided to succeed when they get out of prison? Well, they're probably going to go back to the life they knew before, because that is what the system has taught them is the better option, or is the non-punished option. I think there's an important role for work in prison. I think that it should be more educational. I think the more educational we make it, the better return on investment we have. Like if we had everybody in prison leaving with a trade or with a craft or with a skill, or actually placed people in employment or took people from maximum to minimum security, and then from minimum security to work release, then from work release to a halfway house where they were working a job that whole time, I think we would have a much lower recidivism rate, because there would be a prison to career pipeline. There would actually be a way for people to sustain themselves. Whereas what we do now is we take people, we kick them out the door with $50 or $200 or whatever it is and say, good luck, like, hope you're okay. Including people on mental health medication who may have 30 days of that medication, and like, okay, here's $50 and 30 days of the medication that keeps you from becoming psychotic and like seeing things that aren't there and becoming violent. Good luck in the world. Now, some people have family and friends, some people have support, but not everyone does. So if we use work and education as the process to empower people and enable people to become better and stronger and more capable, well, we're going to see a lot more success stories. So that is my hope.